Ashmoor Asylum stood at the edge of town like a forgotten monument, its red brick walls faded by time, its windows broken like the souls it once held. Locals called it the Hill, and no one dared go near it after dark. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was cursed. But for Helen Carter it was something worse. It was unfinished business. Helen had never met her Aunt Edith Barnes. Her family rarely spoke about her. When Helen was a child, she once overheard her mother whisper, "They locked her away and never brought her back." That sentence stuck with Helen for years. As an adult, she finally asked her mother what had happened. Her mother's eyes welled up with tears, but she only said, "It's better left buried." But Helen didn't believe in leaving things buried, especially people. She started digging through old family boxes and found a single black and white photo of Edith. In it, Edith looked young, maybe 22. Her eyes held a spark and she wore a white blouse with soft curls in her hair. The photo had been folded and unfolded many times, as if someone had looked at it often but never showed it to others. On the back, in smudged ink, someone had written, "Ashmoor, June 1973. That was the only clue Helen had. She didn't know why Edith had been sent to the asylum. No one had ever confirmed if she died, escaped, or simply disappeared. There was no obituary. No burial record. No explanation. Determined to find out the truth, Helen took 2 weeks off work and drove to Ashmoor, the small town where the asylum still stood. It was her first time visiting. The main street was lined with old shops and sleepy diners. Everything felt stuck in the past. She went straight to the local records office. A kind but hesitant clerk helped her pull the old admission logs. It took hours, but there it was: Barnes Edith. Admitted June 15, 1973. Reason: acute depressive symptoms following family trauma. Her file ended with one line: patient transferred to Ward 7. No discharge date listed. Ward 7? Helen asked. The clerk frowned. That's strange. Ward 7 was shut down after. Well, it's not on any public maps anymore. They had some issues. What kind of issues? Helen asked, leaning in. But the woman looked nervous. I probably shouldn't say. Most of the old staff don't talk about it. That night, Helen booked a room at a motel on the edge of town. She lay awake thinking about Ward 7. What was it? Why was her aunt transferred there? She couldn't stop picturing Edith, alone, afraid, forgotten. The next morning, Helen drove up the cracked road that led to Ashmoor Asylum. The building was massive and worn down, covered in ivy and shadows. The front entrance was padlocked, but someone had broken through a side window. She climbed in carefully, flashlight in hand. Inside, the air was cold and thick with dust. Old hospital beds lay rusted in corners. Patient files were scattered across the floor. The walls still held peeling posters promoting mental wellness and modern treatments. Helen wandered through the halls slowly. Everything felt frozen in time. She passed faded nameplates on doors: Dr. Winston, Dr. Clark, patient room 34. Then she saw a rusted metal sign barely hanging from the ceiling: Ward 7, downstairs. She followed the narrow staircase into the basement. It was darker here and the air smelled of mold and something else, something metallic. At the bottom, she found a long hallway of rooms with iron doors and tiny windows. Most were open, but a few were still locked tight. The walls were padded, and in some rooms the padding had been torn apart, exposing cold concrete beneath. She turned her flashlight to the left and froze. There was a name scratched into one of the walls. The letters were faint but still readable. Edith B. 1974. Helen's heart pounded. Edith had been here. She had left a mark. Suddenly she heard a noise. Not a ghostly whisper. Not a creak. But something real: footsteps. Helen quickly turned off her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall. The sound grew louder, slow, heavy steps echoing through the hall. Someone was down here. She barely breathed. A shadow passed by the end of the hallway. Then silence. After a few minutes, she turned her flashlight back on and crept toward the sound. She reached the end of the corridor and found another locked room. The door was solid steel. On it, someone had spray-painted a word in red: murderer. Helen stared at it, chills crawling up her spine. What had happened in this room? Was Edith kept here? She noticed something strange near the bottom of the door: a scrap of torn fabric caught in the hinge. It looked old, like part of a hospital gown. And next to it, something even more disturbing. A small rusted tag. She picked it up. It had a number 23419. And below the number, Barnes. Her fingers trembled as she held the tag. It was a patient ID badge. And Edith's name was still on it. But just as she was about to turn back, A voice echoed softly from deeper inside the asylum. A man's voice. She wasn't the only one. Helen spun around, heart racing. There was no one there. But the air had shifted. The silence was heavier now. She wasn't alone anymore. Helen stumbled backward, her heart thudding loud enough to drown out every other sound. That voice, calm, male and distant, had come from somewhere inside the old asylum. But she was certain she'd been alone when she entered. She hadn't seen another car, another person, or any sign that the building had recent visitors. She wasn't the only one. The words repeated in her mind. Clutching the old patient badge in one hand and her flashlight in the other, she moved slowly back toward the staircase. Her instincts screamed for her to get out. But the name on the rusted tag grounded her. Edith Barnes. This wasn't just a haunted building. Something had happened here, something real, something evil, and her aunt had been part of it. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees around the asylum swayed like watchers, whispering things she couldn't understand. Helen reached her car and locked the doors. Her hands were shaking as she turned the ignition. But her resolve had only grown stronger. She was going to find out what really happened at Ashmoor. That night, Helen returned to the motel and started digging again. She searched through newspaper archives online and found a few short articles from the 1970s about Ashmoor. Most of them praised the facility for its modern approach to patient recovery. But in the middle of one 1974 article, a name caught her eye. 2 patients, including a 23-year-old Edith Barnes, were reportedly transferred to an isolated wing of Ashmoor following an internal review. Staff declined to comment. That was it. No follow-up. No obituary. No closure. The next morning, Helen visited the local library, hoping for better luck. There, she met Mr. Alfred Greer, a former security guard who'd worked at Ashmoor in the 70s. "I try not to talk about those days," he said after she explained who she was. "That place, it changed people." "Please," Helen said softly. "My aunt was one of the patients. Her name was Edith Barnes. I think she disappeared." At the sound of the name, Mr. Greer's expression hardened. "You're her niece?" he asked, his voice lower. Helen nodded. She was one of the smart ones. Polite. Fragile but sharp. Not like the others. He paused. And then one day she was just gone. Like she never existed. "Do you know what happened to her?" Greer rubbed his face, his hands trembling slightly. Ward 7 wasn't a medical wing. It was where they sent the patients who asked too many questions. Patients who didn't respond well to the programs. "What kind of programs?" He hesitated. "They tested experimental drugs. Unapproved ones. I saw patients shaking, screaming, losing their ability to speak. They called it adjustment therapy. Some didn't survive it." Helen's stomach turned. "Why didn't anyone report this?" He looked at her sadly. "We tried. One nurse did. Her name was Linda Holloway. She was young and brave. Wrote letters to the state board. The next week she resigned suddenly. Said she couldn't take the stress. A month later she was found drowned in her bathtub. You think it wasn't an accident?" Greer didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Do you know where I can find anyone else who worked there?" she asked. "There's one," he said after a moment. "Nurse Connie Price. She was close with some of the patients. Lives just outside town in a trailer park. Doesn't talk much, but she's still around." Helen drove there immediately. Nurse Connie was in her late 70s, with tired eyes and a quiet voice. At first, she was reluctant to speak, but when Helen showed her the ID tag, something changed in her expression. "Edith," she whispered, touching the rusted metal gently. "She was one of the good ones. They broke her down until there was nothing left." "What do you mean?" Helen asked, sitting beside her on the porch. "They kept her in isolation for weeks. Fed her pills that made her hallucinate. Some days she didn't even remember her name. But she kept writing things down. She kept a journal, told me she had to leave behind the truth." Helen leaned forward. "A journal? Do you know where it is?" "I found it in the laundry chute one day. She must have pushed it through the vent so no one would see. I couldn't keep it. If the director had caught me with it, I'd have ended up just like her. So I gave it to someone I trusted. A man named Milo Dent. He worked in records." "Where can I find him?" Connie looked away. "He disappeared in 1981. No one ever found his body." Helen exhaled slowly. "So the journal is gone?" "Maybe not," Connie said after a pause. "Milo had a daughter. Her name was Avery Dent. She still lives in Ashmoor, I think. Teaches at the high school." That evening, Helen found Avery's contact info online and emailed her. She didn't expect a reply. But an hour later, Avery wrote back. I know who your aunt was. Meet me tomorrow. I have something you need to see. It had been a week since Helen's discovery of the old asylum's journal, and the more she pieced together the story of Ashmoor, the more the lines between truth and fiction blurred. What started as a search for her missing aunt had now turned into a full-fledged investigation into a dark and twisted past that no one seemed willing to talk about. Helen sat at her desk, surrounded by the files and documents she'd gathered, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of names, dates, and incidents that no one wanted to acknowledge. She had learned that her aunt Edith Barnes wasn't the only person to disappear from Ashmoor. In fact, there were more cases than the public records showed: missing patients, mysterious deaths, and unexplained accidents. And all of them linked back to the same dark history that had been buried for years. There was a knock at the door. It was Avery Dent, the woman who had given Helen the journal. The expression on her face was serious, almost urgent. Something's wrong, Avery said, glancing around the room as if afraid someone might be watching. You need to leave. Now. Helen frowned, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. What's going on? Avery hesitated before stepping closer and lowering her voice. I've been digging into Ashmoor's records. There's something they didn't want anyone to find, and now that you've discovered it, they'll come after you too. Helen's pulse quickened. Who are they? What do you mean? Avery took a deep breath. The people who ran Ashmoor, they weren't just interested in treating the mentally ill. They were experimenting on them. And those experiments weren't just medical. They were about control, about manipulation. They needed test subjects, people they could exploit. Helen leaned forward, trying to make sense of it all. And my aunt, she was one of those people, wasn't she? Avery nodded grimly. Edith wasn't just a patient. She knew too much, and she started asking the wrong questions. She dug into the asylum's history, found things she wasn't supposed to, and that's why she vanished. Helen's mind raced. What did she find? What was so important? Avery looked away, clearly torn. I can't tell you everything. But I can tell you this: there was a file, a very important one. The one they've been trying to keep hidden. It contains all the evidence of the experiments they conducted. But it's gone now. Whoever was in charge took it before Ashmoor closed down. Helen stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Where is the file now? How do we find it? Avery's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of the table. That's the thing. It's not just a file. It's a series of files, the forgotten files, and they were hidden deep in the asylum's records. If we want to find them, we'll have to go back to Ashmoor. And that's not something I'd recommend. Helen's blood ran cold. Go back to Ashmoor? It's been abandoned for years. No one's been there since the fire. I know, Avery said, her voice tight with fear. But I have reason to believe the files are still there. And they're not just buried in the ashes. They were hidden, and not by accident. Someone wanted them to disappear. But I think I know where they might be. Helen's mind spun. She hadn't planned to return to Ashmoor, not after the strange encounter with the man at the trailer. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, she had no choice. She needed the truth, she needed to find the files before it was too late. Avery seemed to sense her hesitation. Listen, I can take you there. But we need to be careful. There are people who still want those files to stay buried. They've been covering up this whole story for decades. If we go in there, we could be walking into something we're not ready for. Helen nodded, determination setting in. I don't care what's waiting for me. I need to know what happened to my aunt. Avery didn't respond right away. She just stared at Helen, a look of quiet admiration in her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Meet me tomorrow. First thing. We're going to Ashmoor. The day had finally come. Helen couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her stomach as she prepared to meet Avery. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of what-ifs and unanswered questions. The journey ahead would not only be a physical one, but an emotional and psychological battle too. As much as she wanted to find out what happened to her aunt, a part of her feared what the truth might reveal. She packed only the essentials: her notebook, a flashlight, and her phone in case things went south. When she arrived at the old diner where she was supposed to meet Avery, the sun had barely risen, casting a dim orange hue across the sky. Avery was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, looking out at the empty road that led to Ashmoor. Helen took a seat across from her. Avery's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with worry. You ready for this? Avery asked quietly, her voice betraying the anxiety she'd been hiding. Helen nodded, forcing a smile. I have to be. Avery didn't speak for a moment, as if contemplating whether to say something else. Finally, she exhaled sharply. We're not just going to find answers. We're digging into something that was meant to stay hidden, and I need you to understand the risks. Helen straightened in her seat. I've come this far. I have to know what happened to Edith. I can't stop now. Avery studied her for a moment before standing up and grabbing her coat. All right then, let's go. The drive to Ashmoor was silent, both women lost in their own thoughts. The closer they got to the asylum, the more the landscape seemed to warp. The air grew thicker, heavier. Even the trees seemed to be pushing back from the edges of the abandoned building, as if refusing to let anyone come near. When they finally arrived, the asylum loomed before them, its crumbling facade still standing tall, as if defying the passage of time. The iron gates were rusted shut, but they managed to squeeze through a hole in the fence. The ground was overgrown with weeds and vines, swallowing up the path that once led to the main entrance. Everything about Ashmoor felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Stay close, Avery warned, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen nodded and followed Avery as they made their way inside. The building had a cold, damp smell that clung to the walls, and the air felt thick as if the ghosts of the past still lingered here. The deeper they ventured into the asylum, the more the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on them. It wasn't just the decaying walls or the rusting metal. It was something darker, something that felt alive. They arrived at what remained of the records room, the one place they hoped to find answers. But as they stepped through the shattered door, Helen immediately felt a pang of unease. Something wasn't right. The room was scattered with old files, books, and broken furniture. But none of it seemed to match the meticulous order that it had once been in. Papers were scattered everywhere, some torn, some burned beyond recognition. Avery walked further into the room, rummaging through the debris. This is it, she muttered, half to herself. It should be here. Helen tried to ignore the dread creeping up her spine as she joined her. She flipped through some of the papers, but none of it made sense. Most of the documents were incomplete, others were illegible due to water damage. And then she found it. A file hidden under a pile of old records. The edges were frayed, but the name on the front was still legible. Barnes, Edith, case file number 1071. Helen's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the file that had been hidden, the one her aunt had been searching for. She reached for it, but just as her fingers brushed the paper, a loud bang echoed from deep within the asylum. It sounded like something, or someone, had slammed a door shut. Avery's head whipped around, her eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that? Helen froze. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room stretching longer. I don't know, Helen whispered, her voice shaky. But we need to get out of here. Before they could move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the room. Slow, deliberate, like someone was coming toward them. Avery grabbed Helen's arm. We have to go. Now. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to close in as Helen's pulse raced. The file in her hand suddenly felt like a weight she couldn't carry. She turned toward the door, but before she could take a step, a voice rang out, low and chilling. You shouldn't have come here. Helen froze. The voice was coming from the shadows at the far end of the hallway. She couldn't see the speaker, but the voice was unmistakably familiar, though she couldn't place it. Avery pulled her back into the corner of the room, her eyes frantic. We're not alone. The footsteps stopped. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they faded into silence. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. She had the file. The truth was within her grasp. But the price for that knowledge was becoming terrifyingly clear. The silence that followed was unbearable. Helen's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers trembling around the file. The shadows in the hallway loomed like dark, shifting shapes, waiting for something. Anything. But there was no movement, no sound. Only the oppressive stillness of the asylum. Avery's grip on her arm tightened, pulling her back further into the corner of the room. We need to leave, Helen, she whispered urgently. Now. Helen didn't move. Her mind raced as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. That voice was too familiar. No, it can't be. She turned to Avery, her voice barely audible. Did you hear it? The voice. Avery nodded quickly, her face pale. I heard it. We need to go. Whoever it is, they don't want us here. Helen wanted to run. She knew she should. But she couldn't. The file in her hand felt heavier now, as if it were pulling her toward the truth she'd been seeking. The truth about her aunt. About Ashmoor. With a shaky breath, Helen finally pulled her gaze away from the hallway and focused on the file. Barnes, Edith. The words echoed in her mind. The very name that had haunted her for months. The file was the last piece of the puzzle, but she couldn't ignore the chilling warning that had just been issued. The voice, it was someone she knew. Helen tore her eyes away from the hallway and turned to Avery. "We can't leave without knowing what's inside this file. We need to know what happened to Edith." Avery looked torn. Fear was written all over her face, but there was also something else, something in her eyes that Helen couldn't quite read. "Helen, I get it. I do. But this place isn't just haunted by ghosts. There's something much worse here. And we can't let it pull us under." Helen didn't say anything at first, the weight of her words pressing down on her. She knew Avery was right. But she also knew that leaving without the truth would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could feel the pull of destiny, a silent force urging her to uncover the secrets Ashmoor had buried so long ago. With a final nod, Helen opened the file. The first page was a standard medical report, filled with jargon that made little sense at first. But as Helen flipped through the pages, she began to piece together a horrifying story. Edith's case file was marked with phrases like experimental treatments, unusual behavior, and unexplained incidents. But it was the last page that made Helen's stomach drop. Patient Barnes, Edith. Last known whereabouts: abandoned room 117, Ashmoor Asylum. Disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The file also contained a photograph of Edith, her aunt, looking pale and fragile, with haunted eyes that seemed to stare right into Helen's soul. Beside her was a note in the margins, hastily scribbled: "She knows too much. Keep her quiet." Helen's hands began to shake uncontrollably. This isn't right," she murmured. "What is this? Why would they?" Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. The sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall. Avery jumped, her body stiff with panic. What the hell was that? Helen didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the page in front of her, on the photograph of Edith. "She knows too much." The words seemed to burn into her brain. Before Helen could say anything, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed again, closer this time. Not slow and deliberate like before. These were fast, frantic, like someone was rushing toward them. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. The air was thick, suffocating. Avery grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." But Helen's feet were rooted to the ground. Her mind raced as the truth began to form in her mind. Edith had known something. Something that someone didn't want exposed. Something so dangerous that they had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. The footsteps were closer now. So close, in fact, that Helen could hear the faint scraping of metal against stone. She turned toward the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the far end of the corridor, was a figure. A tall, thin figure, dressed in what appeared to be an old nurse's uniform. Helen froze. She couldn't see the figure's face, but she could feel its presence, cold and menacing. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at her. And then, in a voice that was eerily familiar, it spoke. "You should never have come here." Helen's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was her aunt's voice. Avery's grip on her arm tightened once more. "Helen, we have to leave. Now." But Helen couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the figure in the hallway. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive force, like the asylum itself was alive and breathing, watching them. The figure stepped forward, its footfalls slow and deliberate. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. It was coming for them. "Run!" Avery shouted, her voice sharp with panic. But it was too late. As the figure moved closer, it stopped just before the door. Its hand reached out, not to grab them, but to place a crumpled piece of paper on the ground in front of them. Helen's eyes locked on the paper. Her aunt's name was scribbled on it in what appeared to be blood. "Find the truth, or never leave." Before either of them could react, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the chilling silence of the asylum. The silence that followed the figure's disappearance was suffocating. The shadows in the hallway seemed to press closer, as if the asylum itself was alive, holding its breath. Helen and Avery stood frozen in place, staring at the crumpled piece of paper that lay before them. The message scrawled in what appeared to be blood felt like a curse. "Find the truth, or never leave." Avery was the first to move, her voice trembling with urgency. "We need to get out of here, Helen. This place isn't just haunted, it's cursed." Helen didn't answer at first. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. The paper, the warning, it was all too much. But deep down, she knew that the only way to escape the grip of Ashmoor was to uncover its darkest secret. With trembling hands, Helen picked up the paper. There was no turning back now. She had to find the truth. Avery glanced nervously at the hallway, her eyes flicking to every shadow. Helen, please? We can't leave, Helen interrupted, her voice firm but filled with a quiet desperation. We need to find out what really happened here. I need to know what happened to Edith. Avery stared at her for a moment, her fear palpable. Then with a reluctant nod she agreed. But if we're doing this, we do it together. No more running. Together they made their way down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Each creak of the floorboards beneath them sent a shiver down their spines. The asylum was alive with whispers, sounding voices from a time long past, stories of horror and despair. They reached room 117, the one marked on Edith's file. The door was slightly ajar, a cold gust of air spilling out from within. Helen took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The room was as dark as a tomb, the air heavy with dust and the lingering scent of decay. Inside there was nothing but a bed, an old metal chair, and the remnants of medical equipment. But it was what lay on the floor that caught Helen's attention, a small wooden box half buried under debris. Helen approached it cautiously, her pulse quickening. She knew deep down that this was the key to everything. This box held the answers she had been searching for. With a trembling hand she lifted the box. Inside there was a single piece of yellowed parchment. She opened it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. She knew. She saw it all. The truth about Ashmoor and the ones who wanted it buried. If you're reading this, they've come for you too. Helen's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The truth. But it was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. As she stood there, holding the parchment, she felt a sudden shift in the air. The shadows in the room grew darker, and the temperature dropped even further. The walls seemed to close in on them, the asylum's grip tightening. Helen and Avery turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang. A cold voice echoed in the room, one they both recognized all too well. You should have never come. The figure appeared once more, standing in the doorway just as it had before. This time its face was clearer. And there was no mistaking it. The face belonged to Edith, Helen's aunt. You've learned too much, Edith's ghost whispered, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. And now you must pay the price. Helen's heart raced. She knew they were trapped, that there was no escaping the curse of Ashmoor. But there was one thing she had that the asylum could never take away, the truth. We know everything, Helen said, her voice trembling but defiant. We know what happened to you. We know what they did to you. The ghost of Edith's face softened. For the briefest moment, it looked like the woman Helen had known, the aunt she had loved. Then just as quickly the expression hardened again. They killed me, Edith's ghost hissed, her voice growing louder, more urgent. They killed me to silence me. But you can still stop them. You can still expose Ashmoor for what it truly is. The ghost's image began to flicker, the light around her dimming and warping. The walls of the room seemed to bend and twist, warping as if the entire asylum was on the verge of collapse. Find the last piece, Edith said, her voice now a mere whisper. The truth, it lies beneath the asylum. In the forgotten files. Before Helen could speak, the ghost vanished into thin air, leaving only the echo of her words in the room. The air in the room lightened for a brief moment, and the door creaked open. Helen and Avery exchanged one final look before stepping out into the hallway. The asylum was no longer chasing them, it had already claimed them. And it wasn't done yet. The forgotten files. Whatever they were, they held the final secret to the asylum's terrible past. And Helen knew with a chilling certainty that she could never leave Ashmoor without uncovering the truth. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this chilling journey into the haunted halls of Ashmoor Asylum. The truth has finally been revealed, but there's still so much more to uncover. If you've enjoyed this spine-tingling story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our next update.